Hello again, it's me, the Cat here. If you're new here, I am a game master and a world builder. I would suggest watching the first 2 episodes in this series first, The Depths of Fraya. This is a series on world building. Today we're going to be talking about civilizations, and we're breaking it down into 4 different segments like I usually do. Segment 1, where are they? Segment 2, race and build. Segment 3, name and relations. Segment 4, grand opening. Segment 1, where to put your civilizations. To start with, I would look at rivers. Civilizations often pop up along rivers. It's a fresh water source, place to get electricity in some cases. You can use water mills, place to get fresh food, fresh fish, other things like that. And it's easy to travel along rivers. So this is where they usually start. Next would be islands. Islands are a good place. Islands have a lot of natural resources on them. Wildlife, coastline, they have plenty of fish, wood oftentimes. They're also a very good place for civilizations to start or end up. Mineral sites. This would be places where minerals are easily found or gathered. Things like gold, silver, could be a fantasy mineral if you have those in my world. I have something in my world called celestial gold. It's like the rarest type of gold. It's very important to the people there, but it's very deadly to some races. So keep in mind how the mineral would affect the race in question mining it. Is that something they look for or something that they try to avoid? And often these type of civilizations are not the places where you would start. These are civilizations built by other civilizations, states moving small groups over there to mine the resource. These places often do not last very long, only until whatever resource it is drained up. They will come in there, take what they can get, and then leave. Plains. Oftentimes civilizations will start here, sometimes as nomadic travelers. They'll raise livestock and move around a lot. There'll be shepherds and anyone who just raises livestock along the plains. Grass, fat animals, cattle, sheep, horses, whatever. These people are, like I said, nomadic usually, and that will definitely affect their culture, but don't expect them to build walls or oftentimes permanent settlements even. So if you have a civilization that lives in the plains, just expect the civilization to be more about the people and less about the buildings. These people they will build cities, but they'll often be populated by the people that are just coming in from the fields. The population will shift a lot depending on the type of year. And this would be a resource or a good place for another race that I haven't mentioned. If you have your own homebrew race that look for something in particular, something other races don't usually. Assume they don't need food, they don't need fresh water, or something like that. Maybe they live up in the clouds. Just think about what this race is that's building this settlement, and then what would they look for specifically, something unique to their race. Humans often live in valleys and plains and along rivers, but elves often don't. Elves usually live in the woods, which is a lot harder for people to do because it's a lot harder to raise food. But elves, they work differently with nature. They don't need to produce as much as normal humans. They just do things differently, and they live in the woods because that's where they're most comfortable. So if your race is something like that, they like to live in a place that's not usual. Keep that in mind, and definitely go with that because it'll make things way more unique. In my world, there are cloud giants that live up on high mountains and in the clouds. They're some of the only races that can survive up there. So any really high points would normally be inhospitable, but not for them. So they're able to just add another layer of culture, diversity, interest into the world. That's one of the things I really love about fantasy races, is they're able to add things that normal humans can't. They're able to go places we can't, to make even just boring areas like deserts and mountaintops really interesting. Segment 2. Race and build. So keep in mind which race is living in this location. Like I was talking about before, humans live in valleys and along rivers and plains and other places that are easy to live. But not every race has the same preferences. Kaoto are fish people. They live in underwater caves. They don't live in the ocean all the time, but they do need to live in a place that's very wet and has easy access to the water constantly. And they don't like to be in the sun all the time because their skin dries up. So underwater caves are perfect for them. That's where they will always choose to live. So just keep in mind which race is living in this particular state, how many races, maybe. And think about not only the races living there, but how would they build? What would that unique area used by this race look like? What would their buildings look like? What would their streets look like? Do they have streets? Do they just swim everywhere? Think about that. Think about the location. I already talked about Kaoto. They live in underwater caves. That's where they like to live best, and cloud giants like to live up in the clouds. Three crane are like an ant people. They're really tall and big. They like the desert. They don't really need a lot of water or food or anything like that. They're very nomadic, so they like the desert. There's more to it than that, but it's basically where they prefer to live. So think about what would they look for? And then there's history. Some races have history in certain sites. The Voisin people used to live in a city called Elibur, and that was in the Dontrell mountain range, or just below it. But they were forced out of there by the Anatolians a long time ago. The only reason they came back was because they felt that that land was their birthright. It meant a lot to them. It was their home from the beginning. They could have stayed in Voita, on the island. It was very nice there, and they did well. But they wanted more. They wanted their home. So, Mary and Sigurd Dove, they brought their armies back, and they took the land back by force from the Anatolians. And they built the Ankavian Empire. So, history is important. Even if a place doesn't seem like it's worth taking, sometimes it has more than just monetary value or something like that. It can mean a lot to the people there. So keep in mind race type. What type of race is living there? Ogres like to live in swamps and woods. But I need to know what race is going to live in an area before I try to build a settlement there. Because if I go to the swamp, I could build two very different settlements for two very different races. So you need to know who is going to live where. Building type and material. So this would be how the buildings are built, the sort of architecture of them, and what they're made of. Oftentimes the building will be made out of whatever is nearby, whatever they can get a hand of. But sometimes they will bring stuff in from other places. There's stories of people bringing in huge rocks from other countries, and practically wars being fought over these. It was dangerous and inconvenient, but they did it for their own reasons. They wanted these large rocks, even though they couldn't be found in the local area. So think about what they would be made out of. Is it hard to get that material? Is it nearby? Oftentimes it will be just nearby, but it can be very interesting if it was hard to get. And the building type will depend a lot on the material, but also depend a lot on the race building it and their particular style. So just think about what the buildings look like. The Kaoto often just build with whatever driftwood or whatever they can find within those caves, but they don't really build a whole lot. They're fine just living in the caves. The Three Kreen like to burrow underground and build little underground holes and networks like ants do. So they don't really build, but they use every material that they have available to them. Humans often like to build houses and towers and palaces and all the stuff that they can. And it varies so much on the architecture, what it's going to look like, and what are we built of. So keep in mind what the particular type of people looks for and the materials they have on hand and the materials they're willing to get. It will greatly affect what things are going to look like. And how something looks is important, even if it's only important to you. So how many races does your settlement have? That's a big question to answer early on, because you'll kind of need to know how many are there, what's the population density, do they get along, what can they all get from a certain place. If different races try to live together, but they physically can't because they need different things, it's not going to work out. A human and a three crane would never be able to live together because they just need different things. Three crane live in the desert, humans often don't. But the humans and the Akrulus did live together. Akrulus were like people with wings. They were able to fly great distances and lived in very big open houses. But humans were often able to live with them because they needed basically the same things. Akrulus were able to do a lot more. So it was interesting, but not to the point where it was impossible. So think about what kind of races are living there, their relationship, and what that would do to the culture. Would it completely change the way things are? Or would things look mostly the same? When humans and elves live together, things don't change all that much. Their houses may look more extravagant. People are able to save up a lot longer for them, hundreds of years instead of merely 20 or 30. And they're able to build more with what they have. Elves love to use everything at their disposal, whereas humans are more willing to ship things in from far away. When the humans and the Akrulus were living together, it greatly affected the human architecture in the area. They like building big open houses now because that's what the Akrulus did. Even though it doesn't really make sense for them, they have no reason other than just that's what they did in the past. Segment 3. Names and relations. Think about the location of a settlement relative to other states. Where do other people find themselves on this same map? Are they close? Are they far? How is it easy to get to them? Is there a mountain range in between them or merely a river? And what's the relationship that they have with other people? Are they at war with each other or can they get along? Oftentimes, especially towards later on in years, these states will be butted up right against each other. Their borders are right connecting. So you really have to figure out what kind of relationship they have. Are they at war? Is the border basically a war zone all the time? Or is it just a peaceful thing where you can go back and forth when nobody will care? It is important to figure out a country's allies and enemies early on. Even if they're not that important, finding out who they didn't get along with in the beginning is good to know. So next would be race relations. This would be how do the races in a certain settlement get along. With the Anatolians and the Voitans, they don't always get along. Because the Anatolians moved the Voitans out early on. They kicked them out of their home and didn't treat them well in the beginning. And when the Voitans went back, they treated the Anatolians better than they were treated in the past, but still not that great. They didn't force them into slavery or anything like that, but they did take back what they felt was their homeland. And so, although they're both humans, they don't get along that well. Certain things like orcs and ogres do get along very well, though. Humans and elves get along. Dragonborn get along with almost no one. So it's important to know how do races get along within a society, and what would the punishments be for committing a crime against another race? Which race is in charge, and is there a punishment for, say, killing something of another race? History. What is the history of this settlement and the people there? We've kind of been going through this from the ground up, so you should know what the history is at this point, but it is good to look into things that maybe just drew a name on the map, or even just knowing the history of a random settlement you're building right now. Anything interesting is important to note. You don't need to know the name of every ruler, how old it is, when it was founded. and everything like that. Though knowing when it was founded and by who is good, knowing every major war they were involved in, and all the major monarchs is good, it's not always necessary. There are plenty of countries in my world where I don't take my own advice, and I don't know much about their history. I don't know much about who founded them or why. I should, though, try to get better at that. Names. So choosing a name for your settlement can be kind of hard, and I'm not really the best person to tell you how to do it, but oftentimes when I'm coming up with a name, I will just mess around with some sounds that I think would be normal for the people there to make, or names that would be important to them, until I found something that I like. You can also use random name generators, or use a name close to a parent state. In my world, there is a large elvish country called Casolia Eva, and one of their colonies on Dolev was built by them and populated by the Moon Elves, but it later on became independent. Its name is now Corlin Hearth, which is taken directly from its parent. Don't really sound too similar, but the name is meaningful to them. It does call back to their past, their history. So oftentimes taking a name from another name, a nearby country or country that started it, can really help. If you get one big name out there, you get a bunch more little names out of that as well. Use a name that describes place, people, or land. This is often a good way to come up with a name. You could call a land based on the people who live there. Russia, in the real world, was named that because the people who populated it were called the Rus. Russia meant land of the Rus. So, they're very descriptive. Names can often mean exactly what you expect them to mean. They don't have to be very elaborate or special, they're just a name that describes something. There's a city where I live, near where I live, called Big Lake. It was called that because there is a big lake there. Names aren't often that creative. But what you can do is come up with a name for something in another language. That often helps. And as long as people don't look it up, they'll think that it's just a cool name and it doesn't really have to mean anything. You'll know where you got it, and that's really all that matters. And it's important to keep culture in mind with the sound. Like, Russia would sound very different than, say, Saudi Arabia, which is a country in the Middle East. They're very different people. Their cultures are different, and the words, phrases, even the way they sound is different. So just keep in mind, what would a race like that sound? What would their home sound like? It's also good to mix other languages. When I'm coming with a name, I don't usually use just one foreign language. I would usually use two or more. That way it just mixes it up and makes it sound original. Segment 4, Grand Opening. Your civilization is almost done. So lastly, you should think, close to lastly, you should think about enemies and allies. I already mentioned this a little bit before, but really think deeply on who this country is aligned with, who they're neutral about, and who they hate. The Ankivian Empire and the Latacree Empire don't always get along. They're not at war with each other, but they don't really like each other. So, although the two empires own part of the same land, they both own an island called Kray. They often get upset or angry with each other about things like that. Just dealing with each other is hard, but they've never gone into all-out war. Whereas the Ankivian Empire is allied with Sayagra, which is an independent city-state. So their relationship with these two states is very different and very important. Think about their allies. Who are they allied with and why? And why are they enemies with that person in the first place? Are they just competition, or have they been at war for centuries? That would go back into the history thing. Think about trade routes. How is a country shipping goods from one place to another? The Ankivian Empire, I've mentioned this too many times in this episode, it's on the coast. So it has access to the entire Lazar Ocean, which is an ocean filled with trade routes. they can trade with basically anybody. Sayagra is built on the Sayagra River, so they're able to trade that way. Coralline Hearth is built on the Coralline River, which goes out into the ocean, I believe. Maybe not. They're able to ship things all along that river. There's plenty of states along that river to trade with. So trade routes are very important with the settlement. Oftentimes things will pop up just along trade routes. Then think about the culture for a certain race. The culture of Dublin is very Viking-like. The race there is Minotaurs. They raid, plunder, all that stuff. They do more than that. I'm not trying to put down Viking culture. It's just that's most of what they do. So think about the culture of a state and how that might affect their trade routes or allies, enemies, all that stuff. Resources will also decide the size of a state. If there is a lot of something to get, then they will often grow very powerful and start exporting that. This is one of the big reasons why states grow so quickly. It's because they land in just the right spot at just the right time. Get a lot of food, a lot of wood, a lot of gold, whatever the reason. Government. This is one of the last steps. So think about how this government is run. How it's been run historically. What does this particular race like? What would make sense for these people to do? It's the monarchy, a dynasty monarchy, sort of republic, a council, could be anything. You can make up your own stuff. Most governments in my world are monarchy because they're easy to do. They make sense. They made sense historically. They work well. Just a lot of good things about monarchy. A lot of races have chosen it, but a few races do not like monarchy. Namely, the Aarakocras. They believe strongly in republics, voting, democracy, all that. They have pretty much always been run by a president. Currency. Think about what kind of currency this society would use. What makes sense for them to use. Certain places like Dublin, they use salt as their main currency because salt is so important for them for storing vegetables and meat and stuff. They don't really eat a lot of meat, but salt is very good for curing and keeping things. Other places like Lotus would use tea as a currency. Dried, packed tea, leaves, and powder. Certain places use berries, seeds, gold, silver, silk, all sorts of stuff. What makes sense for your society? What resource do they have? Do they just trade livestock with each other? Do they have a lot of gold? Do they have silk, salt, whatever? What makes sense in this case? Trade laws. What would make sense on their laws about trading with other states? Do they tax other ships a lot? Do they mostly let them through? Do they have a sort of free trade laws? Think about that. And think about the laws about foreigners. What happens when a citizen from another country comes in? What might that do to the economy, to the government, and how will they deal with it? Think about tax laws, laws on weapons. All this stuff does affect the everyday lives of people. So lastly would be symbol, emblem, crest, or flag, or all of them. How does your country show itself to the world? What do they use to present themselves? The Achaemenid Empire's flag is a dove, because it's always been ruled by the Dove dynasty. That's just their national symbol. So it makes sense for them. But what makes sense for your civilization? Summary. Cities pop up around resources, then grow from there. The race will matter and help define architecture, resources, placement, relations, all other stuff. Enemies, allies, trade routes. Makes sense of all that. Try to figure out who's trading with who and where places would pop up with that in mind. Think of a name that sounds cool, something you like. It doesn't have to make sense, it just has to work. It just has to be cool. Size of the states and government go hand in hand. The larger the state, the more complex the government will be, the more different that it will look. Keep resources in mind when deciding your currency, and figure out some of the basic laws a society might have. So, tell me what you think. What would you like me to do next? Tell me about some of your civilizations. I would suggest getting Timothy Hickson's books on writing and world building. I learned a lot from him. I would definitely recommend getting those books, volumes 1 through 3. So, goodbye and good luck.